Murder comes in so many ways. Killers have options.
When was your first murder? He said nasty things about me. He said so I chucked him under the tube.
When talking to police, a man called Kieran Kelly owns up to being a murderer. Some will one day claim he's killed 31 times. His favoured weapon, his bare hands and his strength. He pushes some victims onto the London rail tracks.
The very first murder that he admitted was under a tube.
Kieran Kelly was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of another man at Tooting Beck tube station in London.
And then he started to relay story after story after story.
Kelly operates in plain sight, camouflaged amongst the commuters or targeting the low-hanging fruit, those least able to look after themselves.
These were homeless people. These were people that had lost contact with people that cared about where they were. They were also vulnerable because a lot of them were addicted either to drink or to drugs.
The story of Kieran Kelly has become one of the most enigmatic and troubling criminal mysteries of our times. A twice convicted murderer who brazenly admitted to many more kills.
There's a big discrepancy between 31 and 2.
Over decades, London harboured an assassin, but was he a pusher on the underground? What went on inside the mind of a serial killer?
She fought like hell.
Serial killers have a desire to kill. They have a thirst to kill.
Travelling the underground is a means of getting from A to B, but not for all of us. For some, it's a place of warmth. A ticket to ride can offer shelter from the cold, a haven. But as some descended to their safe place, they could meet a man who, like them, was sleeping rough, a very territorial vagrant who could kill. This was his platform, his tube station. Ordinary commuters might come and go, but fellow seekers of shelter, like Kieran Kelly, should move away fast.
I think what's particularly distinctive about Kelly's victims is how vulnerable they were. These were homeless people.
From 1953 until the dawn of the 21st century, the Irish labourer Kieran Kelly chose the underground to occasionally attack people. But his photograph was not plastered as a warning to commuters. Police were not on the hunt for him. Remarkably, his deeds were unheard of.
This just wasn't a story that I had ever even heard, even a whisper about, something about an Irish killer in London that had killed, upwards of a dozen people and potentially more.
Some argue that the Kieran Kelly serial killer story has never been sensationalised in the media because of who he chose to kill. Fellow vagrants. The men and women often overlooked by Londoners going about their daily business.
Mind the gap, please.
And it's really sad because, you read these cases and you kind of think, oh, well, it was part of the homeless community. These are people that were born with no different hopes and dreams than any other baby.
Linda Papadopoulos has been on a journey of exploration as she tries to uncover what made Kieran Kelly tick and how many times he actually killed, to discover the truth of the Kieran Kelly mystery, one which begins back in his native Ireland, where his early life is crowded with complexity.
Or I went back to his home place. So I could use a parish record in where he's from. It's a small village called Rathdowney in County Laois. A couple of thousand people, very rural in the Irish Midlands, very quiet village.
A trip to Rathdowney serves only to deepen the mystery about Kelly. The apparently happy family were lifelong locals who disappeared overnight.
What we know about his family background is that it's relatively stable.
They left all of a sudden, which in itself was slightly unusual because the family had roots within that area, within that rural area of Ireland. They weren't a first-generation family living in that area. They had parents and grandparents who had grown up in that area.
He doesn't leave this small town in Ireland, to find his fortune. I think he's running away from something.
It was kind of noteworthy for people who lived in the area that the Kellys just left town all of a sudden.
Why had the Kelly family been so quick to leave? Was it because the still teenage Kieran had killed for the first time? A macabre discovery was to be made when others moved into the Kelly family home, and the man of the house began some DIY.
Digging his garden one day with his son, digging a trench to bring a water pipe from the house to the road, they hit bones and they dug a little bit further and they turned the sod and they found what they assumed were skeletal remains. Now they felt that it could have been a person. There was a wire noose around the neck. It lends itself to the theory, did Kieran Kelly, could he possibly have killed in Ireland as well as England? So it's just another point of intrigue that hangs on a Kelly story.
The Kellys moved to Dublin, where Kieran was no stranger to the local police. Something else emerges about him in devoutly Catholic Ireland. He seems to have done battle with his sexuality.
I think what he may very well have been running away from was the fact that he had this ambivalence around his sexuality, a sexuality that at that time would have been vilified.
Perhaps then his homosexuality is one of the causes of Kelly's decidedly antisocial behaviour.
His crime record or his rap sheet, runs as thick as a telephone book for petty offences. It's been a feature of the Kelly story, his sexuality and his homosexuality.
Not only was being gay frowned upon in society, it was still a criminal offence. Kelly's sexuality will become fundamental to understanding his methods, motivations, and his mind.
The idea that you have to repress your truth, right? Repress something as natural as breathing and eating, something as natural as looking in the mirror and knowing what you see is hugely detrimental, hugely detrimental. We know that this kind of repression can lead to things like depression and anxiety, and indeed a self-loathing or a loathing of one's community. And it may be that this is precisely what we're seeing in this case.
The policeman who interviewed Kieran Kelly and who was part of the team which would lay murder charges against him is former Met detective Ian Brown, someone who believes Kelly's fight with his sexuality is key to his story.
Tell me what it was like in 1953 for homosexuals.
Well, homosexuality was still a crime. There was gay bashing going on. Everything was hidden from a homosexual point of view. There weren't gay parades and gay pride, and people hadn't come out. So it was a totally different attitude from the public because they were criminals. So although people say, oh, it's homophobic, it wasn't. It was the fact that that is a criminal act. So you were brought up to think, well, that is a criminal act. It's the same as theft or other things.
Sure. So Kelly would have been brought up thinking there's something wrong with me, right? That this is not only not okay,
that he
I'm
wouldn't
bad.
Thinking that he would never admit to being homosexual, yeah.
In unravelling who Kelly may or may not have murdered, the start of his confirmed killings is 1983, when, already a heavy drinker, Kelly was a vagrant living rough in South London. That's when Detective Ian Brown came across him and discovered the ferocity of extreme vagrant-on-vagrant violence.
I was Detective Inspector at Clapham Police Station. The night before I met Kelly, there's an old tramp by the name of Boyd, who's a typical tramp, no trouble at all, but always drunk. And that night, the two young police officers went out onto Clapham Common, where they found Boyd comatose and it's raining and it's messy. Well, they didn't exactly do the right thing. They should have picked him up and taken him over to Brixton, but they didn't. They put him in a police van and took him to the police station. Boyd was put in a cell and passed out. The following day, at about midday, an old guy is up in Clapham High Street, sitting down, just watching the world go by, when he's approached by two tramps, one called McManus and one called Kieran Kelly.
Kelly and another street drinker called Paul McManus were on Clapham Common. There was a botched robbery of a guy called Walter Bell. Kelly twisted his arm around his back, pulled the ring off his little finger.
They basically rob him of a wedding ring and his watch. Very quickly, they're arrested, two vagrants, two tramps, taken to Clapham Police Station. The station sergeant has got 4 cells and he doesn't really want to contaminate all of them, so he thinks it's a good idea to put the two new tramps in the same cell as the drunken old one who's asleep on the floor.
When they got to the cell, William Boyd was there, another homeless street drinker, often picked up to the police and pretty well known. He was in the cell sleeping it off. Ian Brown, it was coming up to the end of the day. Ian Brown was getting ready to go home when he started to hear screaming coming from the corridors of the police station.
A young detective shouts, "Governor, Governor, quick, down the cells." So I go down to the cells, and there I see Boyd with a sergeant giving him the kiss of life. Lovely, dirty, smelly old tramp, and somebody's giving him the kiss of life. So I went over and felt his pulse, no pulse.
And when he looked into the corner, he seen a calm, cross-legged Kieran Kelly in his bare feet.
And I looked down and I noticed that round Boyd's neck is 2 long socks that have been knotted together, and he's been garroted.
So the officers that are there haul Kelly out of the cells, pull him into an adjoining cell, and pretty quickly he confesses to the murder of William Boyd. And within 24 hours, they have him in an interview room.
Ultimately, we get Kelly out and talk to him. It's obvious what he's done, and he's quite happy with it. Puts his hands up and says, "Yeah, well, the dirty old bugger was snoring, and he ain't going to snore no more." And it's just, that's it. So we've got a murder in the cells, we've got Kelly, end of story.
Except it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. A drunk homeless man called William Boyd has been murdered in a police cell in Clapham, London. His assailant, Kieran Kelly, is proudly boasting about it. The detective, hearing his story, senses there may be more that Kelly would like to admit to. He was in a mood to reveal, rather than hide truths that he'd lived with for decades.
So I said, "All right, well, tell us the story then." I said, "When was your first murder?" He said, 1953. Coronation year.
Kelly was admitting to having begun murdering people 30 years ago.
So I came over with Christy Smith, which was his mate, from Ireland. He said, and he said nasty things about me. He said I was gay. He said, so I chucked him under the tube at Baker Street Tube Station. And then he started to relay story after story after story.
Did unsuspecting policeman Ian Brown have a serial killer on his hands? Kieran Kelly had confessed to murder in a police cell and then freely admitted to pushing a man to his death on the tracks at a London Underground tube station. What else would he admit to? The detective and the killer were playing a game, the investigator acting dumb, the murderer leading the interview. But how much of what Kieran Kelly is saying at the time is true?
So do you feel at this point that he's enjoying this, sort of sharing
yeah,
it with you?
it's bravado.
It's bravado. So
Yeah.
he's smarter than you. He's killed all these
Yeah.
people. Look how clever he is. So can I ask you? So you're hearing this. What's the dance? Explain to me, like what? Again, as a police officer, you're trying to kind of handle that fragile ego, get as much as you can. So how do you handle it? How do you kind of draw this information out?
Well, I'm highly delighted. I've got something different. It's not just a dead body in the cell, and suddenly you realise that you're onto something, but you don't know what it is.
Are you feeding the ego? Are you kind of bigging him up?
Completely feeding him, and telling him how clever he is and how's he managed to get away with this all these years, and the sergeant and I are just looking at each other and thinking, let him go, and so we keep telling him how wonderful he is, and he keeps giving us more and more and more.
Kelly soon volunteered another victim. He offered a name which meant nothing to Ian Brown: Hector Fisher.
Now, Ian Brown kind of went with the flow and just, played along and said, well, I don't know, you tell me. And Kieran Kelly said to him, you're talking about Fisher, aren't you? And Ian Brown, not having a clue who Fisher was, said, that's the one, and signalled to a station sergeant to go contact the police archive and find out who Hector Fisher was. And he came back with information on Fisher.
He suddenly turned round to me and he said, oh, I'm too clever for you, aren't I?
I'm too clever for you.
I said, oh, always, Kelly. He said, yeah, you didn't know it was robbery, did you? I said, no, I didn't. I said, which one are we talking about then, Kelly? He said, Fisher.
Ian Brown wasn't aware of a Hector Fisher. They picked Kieran Kelly out of the cells for strangling William Boyd. And next thing, they're in the middle of this rambling confession. And he throws out this name, Hector Fisher, who he said he killed in Clapham Common in 1975.
I said, well, tell us all about it then. He said, I'm too clever for you. He said, I robbed him. He had a lot of money. He said, but I left £20 in his pocket. I stabbed him. Oh, okay, Kelly.
Kieran Kelly told the police that he knew how much money was left on the body. This was the point that the prosecution made play of in court, was that only the killer could have known, how much money was left on Hector Fisher's body. And Kieran Kelly had told this to the police in Clapham Police Station in 1983.
So we then get the file out and we find that exactly £20 was found in the pocket when the pathologist went to the scene, and the wounds were as Kelly described it. So suddenly we've got Kelly putting his hands up to a murder that we
Never associated with him.
never associated with him.
What emerged from the police file was that Hector Fisher's murder had remained unsolved for 6 years, but there had been no public clamour for justice for an unsolved murder. The victims were off society's radar screen, the underclass on the underground. Kelly's reputation amongst the homeless community meant that he was actually interviewed about the murder.
Kieran Kelly was interviewed at the time, and nothing happened. So possibly in Kieran Kelly's mind, he had outsmarted the police, and the reason why they couldn't stick anything to him when they questioned him initially was because he'd left this sum of money on the body.
Fisher's murder was, according to Kelly, money motivated. But were things more complicated?
Yet what we hear time and time again are people either reporting that Kelly was gay or that he had a loathing for the gay community, possibly because of his own repressed feelings.
Or it could also have been a convenient excuse for Kieran Kelly to kill Hector Fisher. They went drinking together, they were sat on a park bench. Next thing, Hector Fisher makes an advance on Kieran Kelly. He repels this advance, repels it in the most brutal way. You know, he attacks him. I think there was upwards of 21 stab wounds and wounds from blunt force instrument and a deep wound on his chest as well. So, you know, there could have been some kind of sexual relationship, some kind of sexual arrangement between Kieran Kelly and Hector Fisher that led to Kieran Kelly attacking Hector Fisher in Clapham Common in July 1975, you know, that led to his death.
With such a brutal attack on Hector Fisher, why were police unable to find witnesses at the time of the crime? The answer helps explain why so much of the Kieran Kelly story remains unproved.
The biggest problem, of course, with this whole system is that Kelly is a vagrant. The whole of the vagrant community is a moving community.
And when I look down,
The Hector Fisher murder in 1975 had gone unsolved in part because the witnesses, homeless wanderers living on the very edge of society, had simply moved on. Another scenario which explains why Kelly was seldom found guilty of killing involved his claims that he had murdered a man called Maurice Whaley. In that story, the truth was almost impossible to establish.
One of the ones that Kelly admitted to was a guy who he said he'd hit over the head with a brick and was found at the bottom of a set of stairs going down to a ground floor flat. And everything was right. But Kelly said he'd hit him over the head with a brick. Well, it had gone down as accidental death because he was a tramp who'd fallen down the stairs. And this was the biggest problem.
So there's a fear that, from your point of view, that he's just now at this point wanting to big himself so much that he's going to just pick on every death and say, no, that was me as well, and that was me. So there's going to be an overestimation, right?
Yeah, I mean, everything that Kelly now says has got to be investigated to see if the facts tie up. And there's, in actual fact, there was one that he told us he'd done, and he couldn't have done because he was in prison at the time. So he chucked in a few, and I don't think that anybody will ever know exactly how many murders Kelly committed.
One of the most frustrating, problematic things about piecing this together was the amount of lying that Kelly does. So we know he admits to murders that he couldn't possibly have done because he was in prison at the time that these were committed. So the question then becomes, what is he getting out of saying these things? Is he a fantasist? Is he getting some sort of, bravado? Is he feeling powerful by taunting the police and feeling that, they can't catch him, he's done more than he has? I think these are those niggles around us never really being able to have a clear understanding, not only of how many people Kelly killed, but indeed his state of mind when he was lying about performing those acts.
But police are confident that Kelly murdered many more than the two for whom he was convicted. For example, the case of Edward Toll. Ian Brown knew Kelly had known Toll. Now he wanted to know more.
You shouldn't hang his socks.
For some reason, and you never know why, you'd draw Kelly's file out, which in those days was all handwritten and everything was not on computer. So we have a look at Kelly's file.
And they have information on an acquittal from 1977 of a guy called Edward Toll, another homeless, street drinker, tramp, dosser.
Toll had been murdered, Kelly the only police suspect. He stood trial, but there was to be no conviction.
We see that he's been found not guilty of murder at the Old Bailey.
So he reasons that, okay, hey, he's after confessing to Boyd. Maybe now he's going to confess to the murder of Edward Toll in 1977, the one he was acquitted for. So he threw out a general question to kind of test Kelly and just said, okay, Kelly, why don't you tell me about all the other murders then?
So we looked that up, and the story is this, that Kelly sleeps in churchyards, on tombstones, and he's gone into Kennington churchyard.
What happens is that Kelly normally sleeps on this tombstone, and he goes there one night, and lo and behold, Edward Toll is in his place.
So he's not very impressed with that, and he has a rope round his, keeping his trousers up. So he goes over, takes the rope off.
He gets so upset that he garrots him. And he does this with other homeless people watching him.
As he walks away, one of the other old tramps says, "Oh, Kelly, you might have killed him." So Kelly goes back, puts the rope round again, does it again and says, "I effing well have now."
Now, at the time, these witnesses are taken in, they give statements, they explain what happened, and so Kelly's put in prison.
But this seemingly cut-and-dried case proved problematical for prosecutors and goes to the heart of why Kieran Kelly is the serial killer the world is only now discovering. With witnesses who'd seen Kieran Kelly garrote Edward Toll, a murder conviction looks certain.
6 months pass. Because Kelly's in prison, he comes clean. He's not drinking, he's not doing drugs.
The only trouble is that this is what the tramps tell you at the time. Wonderful, they've all made statements. But by the time it gets to court, which is 6, 7 months later, Kelly's been in prison, he's cleaned up, he's quite smart.
He's able to seem articulate and he's able to seem confident. However, the people that saw it, the homeless people that were around at the time who were struggling with alcohol and drug abuse, haven't had 6 months to get clean. So their stories seem disjointed, they've forgotten half of what they said.
And the tramps that are giving evidence against him can't remember yesterday, let alone 6 months ago. I think it's quite beautiful that he would never, ever admit the murder in the churchyard.
Would he not?
Well, he wasn't guilty, was he? The court told him he wasn't guilty.
And therefore he took what the court said.
Wasn't guilty. Oh, yeah. Kelly was guilty. Of course he was guilty.
So it's interesting. So he admits to things he hasn't done, and yet this one incident, which is one of, very similar to other things he admitted to, he decides not to because he was told. So there's something in a very almost childlike way of, well, they've said I haven't done this, but...
So I haven't. And that's Kelly, in a nutshell.
And so the case is thrown out, and he lives to kill another day.
Though Kelly was acquitted, Edward Toll is acknowledged by all who have looked at the case as a Kelly murder victim. That brings his murder count to a minimum of 3. So what is the likelihood that he killed many more times and on the London Underground? The way he murdered makes Ian Brown convinced that Kelly had struck many more times.
Kelly was spontaneous. I don't think he would ever have planned a murder. It just happened.
Just impulsive.
Oh yeah, completely and absolutely. He didn't like him snoring, so he snuffed him. That's Kelly's version. The one sleeping on my tombstone. So he killed him. He didn't go into that part thinking, who can I murder?
No, indeed.
This guy just happened to be there and Kelly didn't like it.
And fellow vagrants just happened to be in tube stations, which can provide a safe space. Warm, plenty of people who might call the police in the event of violence. According to Kelly in his interview with Ian Brown, it was the Underground where he allegedly pushed a friend onto the tracks, his first kill.
And he said Kelly told him, "It started in 1953 when I came to London for the Queen's coronation and ended up pushing a friend of mine, Christy Smith, in front of a train at Baker Street tube station."
As researchers and detectives later probed, some evidence did appear suggesting that Kieran Kelly was someone who regularly pushed fellow vagrants that he came across onto the tracks of the London Underground.
In 1982, Kieran Kelly was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of another man called Francis Taylor at Tooting Bec tube station in London. Taylor and Kelly had been in company, had come into the station together. There'd been some kind of altercation, and Kelly had pushed Francis Taylor in front of a train that was entering the station. Now, by some kind of miracle, Taylor ended up in the well underneath the tracks, and when the train backed up, he got himself back up onto the platform, and Kelly was later picked up by the police, charged with attempted murder. But, you know, Taylor wasn't unknown to Kelly. They kind of drank together on the common, and, you know, after a few weeks, the police picked up Kelly. He was arrested for the attempted murder of Francis Taylor, but that case was acquitted. It went to the Old Bailey and nothing became of it. And then in 1982, another man who was called Gordon McMurray, who went by the nickname Jock Toland, he was pushed in front of a train by Kelly at Oval tube station. Again, bizarrely, similar circumstances to Taylor. He ended up in the well underneath the tracks and survived too. The police had a line-up. Jock Toland, aka Gordon McMurray, fingered Kelly, but, you know, after that decided that he didn't want to press charges either. So there's two definite attacks on two different tube lines, 5 years apart. 1977, a man called Francis Taylor, and then 5 years later, 1982, Gordon McMurray. Both survived, and this is one of the interesting things about the case, is the branding of Kelly as a London Underground serial killer. There's nothing on his rap sheet that shows him having murdered anyone on the Underground, but there is, you know, an attempted murder charge that he was acquitted of, and it's also on the police records that he pushed another man in front of the tube in 1982.
3 certain murders to his name, 2 convictions, and Kelly's own word that he'd killed many times by shoving vagrants onto the tracks of the London Underground. 2 recorded cases of him attempting murder in precisely that way. Just how many people did Kelly kill? And why? Kieran Kelly may have been convicted for 2 murders and been acquitted for a third he was seen to have committed, but that was just part of his confession story.
What we could prove was maybe 5, 6 murders. Everything right. Everything that Kelly said was exactly on the dot. Even down to one in Balham. It was another tramp. And Kelly had told us that, again, he didn't like him sleeping where he was sleeping. And
it seems certain that the man was called Mickey Dunn. Irritating Kelly was not a good idea. As Dunn sat out on the common, Kelly disappeared, then returned with a bottle of something.
So he bought a bottle of white spirit, and he'd actually poured it down the guy's throat.
Another vagrant called O'Connor was drinking with Kelly and Dunn near the library at Tooting Broadway. O'Connor left to buy more cider, and on his return, he found that Kelly and Dunn had been fighting.
And then the guy had gone to Peckham, where he'd been taken into a tramp's unit, and then they transferred him to King's College Hospital, and he died, but it went down as cirrhosis of the liver. And it was, I mean, the guy died of cirrhosis of the liver, but Kelly helped him along his way by pouring stuff down his throat.
If true, and the evidence supports the claim, Mr. Dunn was yet another victim of Kieran Kelly. On the stories went. Not only was proof hard to find, there was no public pressure for charges to be brought by Ian Brown.
He admits himself that because the other confessions of murder that he made were of, tramps and homeless street drinkers, that there just wasn't the incentive from the police to go and pursue these.
With 2 convictions ensuring that Kelly was never going to be freed, the police at the time decided not to pursue other cases.
There was no great public outcry. There was no, impassioned call for, justice to be served here. It was just, they had him on 2, he was going down for 2. It wasn't worth their while to pursue anymore.
They were people that slept rough. They were people that could go missing without anybody noticing. In many cases, there were people that struggled with either mental health or substance abuse issues. And I think very sadly, they were people that many times just felt helpless. So it was a very kind of ideal situation for someone like Kelly, because he was able to engage them, to do anything that he wanted, and actually, for many years, go completely undetected.
And what of the claims that Kelly was a pusher on the London Underground?
I think he was capable of killing somebody on the London Underground. The thing about Kelly's confession, which does run into double figures, is that the people and the murders that he claimed to have committed, only one of them, Christy Smith, was on the London Underground. The other murders, you're talking about poisonings, strangulations, stabbings, beatings to death. I mean, his methodology to kill, was varied. It wasn't, or his claims, he wasn't just confined to pushing people off train platforms. He was creative in how he was, trying to kill.
Funnily enough, the last thing that he did before the murders in the cell was push another vagrant under a train at Kennington railway station. And in between, there are maybe 2 or 3 other incidences where people have gone under trains and Kelly's been around.
Right.
So there's no doubt that Kelly pushed people under a train, or that he did it a couple of times or 3 times.
Did he admit, how many did he admit to actually doing?
Because they didn't die, he wasn't admitting anything about pushing people under the train other than the 1953 one. But reading and checking back on his history, he'd been interviewed a number of times where vagrants had fallen under tubes, and Kelly was about.
Right.
So murder-wise, I can't think of a murder under the train that actually was completed. Whether he pushed someone under a train and they didn't die, certainly the one at Kennington, the train driver stopped. So there's one that Kelly actually admitted to.
If you're coming to his story cold, you'll see a murder and a manslaughter. William Boyd and Hector Fisher. That's 2. But down the other end, you've a claim by a former policeman who did actually get a commendation on the case, who's saying that Kieran Kelly killed up to 31 people and had confessed to killing up to 31. So the fight for the truth in the Kelly story is somewhere between those 2 figures, 2 and 31. And if Kieran Kelly's confession and his admissions are to be believed, number 1, that kind of backed up by the testimony of a detective inspector who enjoyed a stellar career and worked on some really notable cases like Ian Brown did, that they felt confident that Kieran Kelly admitted to over a dozen murders. They felt confident that they had the evidence to pursue 5, maybe 6 of those murders, and they were sure that he did 5 or 6 of those murders. I think, in the fight for the truth in the Kieran Kelly story, I think that's where I settle. I settle on the testimony of, the team of detectives who felt they had him on 5, maybe 6 murders, and they brought home a conviction on 2.
2 convictions, 1 acquittal where it seems certain he was the killer, 2 murdered vagrants who'd been with Kelly moments before they died, 2 charges of attempted murder which saw juries return not guilty verdicts, and Kelly himself claiming to have killed a further dozen vagrants. But no murders on the London Underground can be assigned definitely to Kieran Kelly. He was, nonetheless, a serial killer. Why?
So what do we know for sure? We know Kelly definitely killed and was convicted of 2 people. In fact, we know it's 3 because there was a lot of confirmation on what happened with Edward Toll, even though he wasn't convicted. That's 3 people. We also know that he admitted to crimes he couldn't have committed. We also know that people that spend a lot of time with him believe, and these are police officers, seasoned detectives, that he probably killed in the region of about 12 to 15 people. Fact of the matter is, what we know for sure is that he was a dangerous man. He never got to a point where he was able to settle whatever demons that he was fighting with. And finally, the fact of the matter is that he was a murderer. Now, why he did it? Well, that's a key question. So there's these themes, right? There's this, he's annoying me, he's snoring, he's sleeping where I am. But then there's also these themes about, you know, he said I was gay, he tried to, you know, he wanted my bum, all these kind of. So are you at this point starting to put together a picture of who Kelly is? So if you were to get an impression at this point, how would you know, what's in your mind?
Mad. I'm not a psychologist or anything like that, and I don't know exactly what his problems were, but whatever mental problems they were, I'm sure all of them apply to Kelly. Kelly had 3 problems. 1, he hated homosexuals. 2, he hated alcoholics. 3, he hated tramps. And he was all 3.
Kieran Kelly killed those he despised most, those like himself. Homeless drunks, some of whom may or may not have been gay, whilst Kelly himself refused to admit whether or not he was gay. Suggestions that he might have killed 31 times, with many victims pushed to their deaths on tube tracks, are largely dismissed by those in authority. But those same investigators do not deny that many died at his hands, and that the demons Kelly kept hidden from those who passed him by each day mean we will probably never truly be able to get inside the mind of the serial killer that was Kieran Kelly.
I think Kieran Kelly was extremely dangerous. His audacity, his disrespect for human life, and I think the lightness with which he took his crimes, the way that he'd at the same time take pride and taunt and go back and forth, it was a game to him. And I think when life and death becomes a game, well, then you have a recipe for a very dangerous human being.